Now I'm pleased to introduce to you Sam Hall, who's the Acting Director of Program Development with PHMSA.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. We've been working quite a lot in public awareness, and I'm excited to talk with you about some of the things that we've done. I think Mr. Insko brought up quite a few very important points that we have taken to heart. Over the past several years, we've been working hard on improving public awareness through a collaborative stakeholder approach. And I do differ from Mr. Insko in one point, and that is that I do believe that meaningful public awareness is on the horizon. I think that we can do this better. I think that we can make public awareness more meaningful. So in the brief amount of time I have, and I certainly wish I had more time and that we could have devoted some more time to this, because it's a complex issue, and I think that a lot can be said about it. But in the brief time that I have, I want to talk about four major points, and those are stakeholder responsibility, the right message from the right people, the proper role for regulation, and what's next for PHMSA. I'm going to breeze through these slides, but I hope that some of these points that I'm making here will spur some thought as well as answer some questions. So the first point I want to make is that we're looking at a shift, a focus more on stakeholder responsibility. You know, when we talk about public awareness, we're not talking about just a landowner who has a pipeline on his land. We're talking about four major stakeholder groups. We're talking about elected officials. We're talking about emergency responders, excavators, and sorry, I'm blanking. The fourth is emergency responders, elected officials, excavators. Thank you, excavators. Sorry about that. Should have had it on my slide, or I wouldn't have forgotten. What we're finding is that the current approach to public awareness is really producing diminishing returns. You know, a lot of what happens, I think, is that we, as a federal agency and as pipeliners, we're putting a lot of messages out, and those that choose to be aware are aware. We are choosing to be aware. We are choosing to be engaged. Many others are not choosing to be aware, despite access to lots of information. With your points well taken about what kinds of messages are being put out. This information blast approach is producing diminishing returns. So one of the things that we've learned as we've discussed public awareness and our experiences inspecting public awareness programs and working with pipeline operators and with the stakeholder audiences that are meant to receive these public awareness messages is that communities really have a responsibility to act on public awareness information. And right now they're not required to do that. So you've got a situation where the current regulation, the way it's set up, pipeline operators are responsible for public awareness, and communities are not. Emergency responders are not responsible for doing anything with the messages that the operators deliver. Excavators are not responsible for doing anything with the messages that the operators deliver. Homeowners are not responsible for doing anything. It's believed that the only responsibility for public awareness is on either the government or on pipeline operators. That leads me to the point that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Or can you? And I think it depends on the horse. So the reason I brought up the fact that when we talk about public awareness, we're talking about four different stakeholder groups, is that there are ways I think that we can crack the public awareness nut in a very different way from how we do it today. This information blast approach, it doesn't work for many of our stakeholder audiences. I believe that it's possible that PHMSA can develop regulations that require some public awareness stakeholders to act on the information that they receive. There are examples of this already. For example, the EPA has the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act that requires operators of chemical facilities to report their facilities and what's in those facilities to local communities. And those local communities are then required to act on that information by developing hazard mitigation plans for the worst case scenario for that facility. Right now, pipeline operators are exempt from the requirement to report under the Community Right to Know Act. At this point, I'm not proposing that is the solution, but I can tell you that I've talked with several folks in the pipeline community, pipeline operators, folks who are very deeply involved in public awareness. I haven't heard a lot of resistance to the idea that there are possibly ways to say, let's get this information to the people that need to have it, and let's require those people to do something with it, instead of just hoping that they come to the table and engage. You know, in many cases, people simply won't act until they're required to do so. Another example is for our excavation stakeholder audience. You know, you can talk till you're blue in the face about the importance to call before you dig, but there will always be people who break the law. You can talk about the importance of not driving drunk, and there will always be people who drive drunk. What really then changes behavior for excavators is enforcement. And if you can enforce against the excavators who are damaging pipelines unlawfully, now you're really requiring a behavior. It's no longer about hoping that excavators are engaging with operators and hoping that they protect your pipeline. It's about requiring them to do it. And of course, as you know, we've been working very hard on enforcing damage prevention laws across the United States. Again, I wish I had a lot more time to talk to you about that, because that's a very exciting thing. Another big issue that we've encountered as we've talked about public awareness is, who do you trust? Trust is fundamental to engagement. You have to believe that you can engage with someone in a trusting way. Trust is really relative. It's person dependent in so many ways, or community dependent in so many ways. And one thing that we all, I think, can relate to, and certainly something that we've identified as we've talked about public awareness in general, is that stakeholder audiences often trust their own, you know, their own, not others. Do stakeholders trust the federal government? We would like to believe they do. We try to improve trust. It's one of our core values at PHMSA, certainly. But I think, realistically believe that you can't get everyone to trust you simply because some people are distrustful. So, likewise, do stakeholder audiences trust pipeline operators? Are pipeline operators always the right person, or always the right organizations to deliver messages, public awareness messages? I think we can all agree that that's probably not the case in every case. I think that, you know, some people simply will not trust what's being delivered by a pipeline operator, despite what's in the message. I think that we can address some of that with some innovative approaches to public awareness. So, for example, with emergency responders, one of the key stakeholder audiences in public awareness. If you can get emergency responders to train emergency responders to deal with pipeline emergencies, you've done a lot better than if you were asking pipeline operators to train emergency responders to deal with emergencies. So the idea behind the pipeline emergency responder initiatives, these are initiatives, we call them PERI for short. These are initiatives in multiple states across the country. A growing set of initiative. I can't remember exactly how many states we have currently under the working with us, but the idea is to bring pipeline operators and emergency responders together to ensure that emergency responders are trained to deal with pipeline emergencies in that state. Pipeline operators are funding the training, but the training is being delivered by emergency responders to emergency responders, and it builds trust and it builds engagement. You're not going to get the same kind of engagement between a pipeline operator and an emergency responder, and, you know, maybe in a drill, certainly you'll get that kind of engagement, you get that level of engagement. But if you want to reach every emergency responder in a state, and you want them to hear the word pipeline, and you want them to understand what a pipeline emergency could look like, that message should come from an emergency responder, not a pipeline operator. You can beg, borrow, you know, ask, plead for emergency responders to come to a dinner where you talk to them about emergency response for pipelines, and if they don't come, they don't come, and they don't hear the information. So these initiatives, like the pipeline emergency responder initiatives, really, I think, go a long way to creating trust and advancing the cause of public awareness. Another example, of course, is the Common Ground Alliance, the organization that's focused on excavation damage. That's a consortium of folks who work every day in excavation and underground utility safety. They're the right folks. People in the Common Ground Alliance trust one another. They believe strongly that excavation damage prevention is a shared responsibility. While it's important that the 811 message gets out from pipeline operators, I think it's also important that it gets out from others. It's not always going to be effective if we just rely on pipeline operators to be delivering that message at all times. There's also the issue of consolidated messages versus operator-specific messages. Information overload is a very serious problem for some of our stakeholder audiences. And in particular, emergency responders are disgusted with what's going on in public awareness in the pipeline world. They are getting mailings, they're getting information from lots and lots of pipeline operators, and if you're in a pipeline dense area, and you're a firefighter or you're a fire company in a pipeline dense region, you are going to get an overload of information. That ends up getting piled up and thrown out because it is too much to read. It's very repetitive. You've got some of the same messaging in all of these messages, all of this documentation. That makes public awareness very ineffective for that stakeholder audience. We're failing them. So there are common messages that apply to all pipeline operators. Pipelines are typically underground. They're made out of steel. They are protected this way, that way, the other way. They move these kinds of products, et cetera, right? These are common messages to nearly every pipeline in the United States. Those consolidated messages can be delivered in a standard way, and I don't have a proposal for you right now on exactly how we would do that, or how the operators would do that, or how the federal government would do that, but there is a real opportunity there to consolidate messaging for that stakeholder audience so that it's not repeated again and again and again by every operator under a federal requirement to do so, and the firefighters are then getting exactly what they need. Now, consolidation of national messages would then free up pipeline operators and stakeholder audiences to focus on very system-specific messages about pipelines. If you have national messages that are common about all pipelines, and then you start saying, okay, but what about this pipeline? Now you can spend a lot more energy on actually talking about this pipeline as opposed to all pipelines in the country. So I think that's an encouraging approach to improving public awareness, especially for specific stakeholder audiences. Now, one of the challenges to this is that operators must feel confident that regulators, both at the federal level and at the state level, will accept this approach as compliant with the regulations. If we don't address this properly, we are going to stifle creativity and really limit operators' options to improving public awareness. Right now, the way we inspect against public awareness regulations is relatively prescriptive in some instances, and certainly it varies from state to state, and it can be very frustrating for pipeline operators to try to be innovative, consolidate messages, and do innovative things that can enhance public awareness when now the regulator comes back and says, yeah, but I can't check this box because you didn't deliver your specific, you didn't deliver this message to these people. That goes deep. I hope that made sense. But the idea of consolidated messages versus operator-specific messages is something that really needs to be addressed. So, engagement. Engagement is important. What are we engaging on? Our public awareness regulations have a fairly narrow focus. Pipeline operators are required to conduct public awareness programs for existing pipelines, and their focus is on the safety of those existing pipelines, what to do in an emergency, how to prevent damage to the pipelines, and so forth. Public awareness regulations right now do not address siting. They don't address climate change. They don't address keeping in the ground issues. They don't address NIMBY or not in my backyard issues, or a host of other pipeline-related public concerns. And so I think it's important as we discuss public awareness that we keep our focus on what it is that we're talking about when we say the word awareness and engagement. What are we engaging on, and what are we trying to make sure that people are aware of? And finally, what is the proper role for regulation with regard to encouraging public engagement, excuse me. Is regulation really the right way to get people to act, to get engaged? I think in some ways, yes. I think in other ways, no. Who engages and why? Does public awareness information encourage engagement? Yes, sometimes, but. The desire to engage is often driven by things that have nothing to do with public awareness information that's delivered by a pipeline operator. Maybe it's an incident or a tragedy. Maybe it's connection to a place. Maybe it's health concerns for yourself, for your children, for your loved ones. Maybe it's a proposed regulation that impacts landowners or businesses. If you know, maybe it's a taking. Maybe it's a, you know, who knows what it might be. Who engages and why is really critical. I think we need to really ask ourselves, how can we better engage in these instances? I think PHMSA may have a fairly limited role in a lot of this, frankly. We may not be the right agency to do that, but I think it's an important question to ask ourselves. And really honestly, can we truly say that public awareness regulations and pipeline operators' public awareness programs can adequately address these lists of concerns? I think you can, you know, we could talk about that all day. We could have a separate conference just for those topics. So I think it's important to stay focused on keep our eyes on the prize when it comes to public awareness, make sure that we're focusing on what needs to be delivered to whom. So what's next for PHMSA? If you're not aware, over the past several years, we've been doing quite a lot of work in public awareness. We conducted a strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats analysis, a SWOT analysis of various aspects of public awareness programs. And we're evaluating elements of public awareness right now that are appropriate for regulatory changes. We do hear you loud and clear, and you're not the only person with your perspective that 1162 is not necessarily the right and only approach. So we're evaluating activities like PERI and other approaches. For example, this Community Right to Know Act. If we can get the elimination or the exemption for pipelines eliminated, so that now communities that receive information about pipelines are required to act to develop hazard mitigation plans, then I think we need to think hard about that, and I think that's a part of the solution. Remember, as the general public, I think a lot of us, again, we're all engaged, we're all involved. But, you know, I've talked to people who have natural gas in their homes and have no idea how it gets there. It just gets there. I mean, it's much more common for people to not have any idea that pipelines exist, much less what they do. And so, you know, the idea of getting folks together, getting you know, public awareness messages to those people, I think is a much greater challenge than those of us here might believe, simply because we are engaged, we are interested in this. I would say broadly, generally, the public is not. We're also engaging, we are currently engaging with the American Petroleum Institute on the 3rd edition of RP 1162. We are driving transparency in this process. We hear you loud and clear on that. We believe strongly that we need to make sure that that process is as transparent as possible, that stakeholders have an opportunity to review and comment on the recommended practice. They do already. The process already exists for that to happen. And we intend to push that to ensure that that's well known. We're also very committed to addressing stakeholder concerns through regulation outside of 1162. That are things that can't be addressed and are not addressed in 1162. We're very committed to taking a good hard look at what we can do from a regulatory perspective to fix the problems that 1162 simply cannot. So with that, I do wish I had more time. I have to stop. I've already been called time. I think it was 5 minutes ago. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Sam.